All right, so I'm pretty happy with all my lines. You've noticed that all my edges seem pretty smooth from the sanders. I took off all those little lines in here from the bandsaw. I took all those down. Okay. I can still see some lines in here, but I'll just sand those in the next step and clean those up. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to router these edges. Okay. A little hand router. I have these, they call them little router pads. So I'm going to put these down to lift my project up off the table a little bit. And I'll be using this router to put a nice rounded edge on the project. Okay. So when I set up a router, I'm going to make sure that, as I could turn this and move this up and down, I'm going to make sure that it's lined up right with the top of the router bit. You can see it kind of arcs and then drops. I'm going to make sure this is lined up just with the top, maybe even a little bit too high. Lock it in, tighten this down. Whenever you're using a router, you're definitely going to have safety glasses on, so I'm going to make sure I got my safety glasses on. Make sure this is in the off position. I don't want to plug it in and it starts and it'll kind of kick. You never want to have your hands under here, because as you're routering, you don't want your fingers underneath. So I'm going to keep my fingers up here, and I'm going to go in a counterclockwise direction. If you want, you can do both sides. You definitely have to do one side, but it's optional if you want to do both. Be careful setting this down. That router blade is still spinning. Okay, so you can see what it did is the router blade is cupped and it kind of makes the opposite shape to what it looks like. You might notice after you do this, you have some burn marks on here. That's not the end of the world. We could always just sand those off. Okay, those are just heat burns from the friction of the router. So the next step would be to sand it. So I have the next step is to sand it. I have 4 different grits of sandpaper. Okay, if you don't know what grit it is, okay, they kind of have a different color. They also have a number on the back. So this is 80 grit sandpaper. The lower the number, the rougher the sandpaper is. And just like the saws, the rougher the sandpaper, it's going to cut the wood, it's going to sand it down faster, but it's also going to leave kind of a rougher finish. So we're going to do 80, then we're going to do 120, 150, and then finally 220. Okay, the 220 is softer. It's not going to cut very fast, but it's going to leave a nice smooth finish. To put this sandpaper into the sanders, I kind of have 2 different sanders here. You can either push down on these clamps to lift it up. You can use a screwdriver to lift it up. Okay, put the 80 grit in there. One side, flip it around. The same thing on the other side. Tuck it in. I didn't give it enough slack. I'm gonna pull it out just a little bit. There we go. Okay, so now I have that ready to go. Now this step is going to take a while, so I'm going to sand this up, and then I'll be back after I sand this with 80. I'm going to do another step. Okay, I did my first sanding with 80 grit. This is an optional step, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take this water bottle and I'm going to spray down my project with some water. What this does is this is going to open up the grain of the wood. I'm going to spray my entire project down, and it's going to make all the grain kind of pop out. So my project after I do this is going to feel really rough. Which is what I want. I want the grain to open up, and then when I sand it down next, it's going to feel very smooth. So I'm going to water it, and then I'm going to let it dry out, and then I'm going to re-sand it, and it's going to make it that much smoother. So when I put the oil on eventually, the oil doesn't make the grain pop. Okay, so that's kind of the point of doing this. Okay. Paper towels. So I'm going to wipe that down. I'm going to give that some time to dry out.